Welcome to part 9 of the Industrial Revolution. Now we're going to talk about Romanticism. If liberalism has a dubious connotation in a modern society, Romanticism probably does as well. I mean, we often tend to misinterpret what we mean when we use the word. It's often used to mean things like sentimental, idealistic, nostalgic, sometimes even erotic, right? But that's not always what we're talking about when we're using it here historically back during this time period, right? The trace roots of Romanticism to the middle 18th century is a reaction to the Enlightenment, right? As we've seen, a number of Enlightenment figures questioned 18th century faith and pure reason, including people like David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Edmund Burke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? As these writers grew more popular in the 18th century, there was a movement to revive the feeling and to glorify sentiment, right? And we see this trend rise in popular sentimental novels of the day. We see it on a much higher plane in German writers and composers of the late 18th century, like Goethe and Schiller and Herder and Mozart, right? It could be argued that there was something political about this idea. After all, who's devouring this Enlightenment and liberal writings? Well, it's the middle class. Against it, writers such as Burke emphasize emotional loyalties to person. Edmund Burke talks about things like loyalty to kings and landlords, for example, rather than to emotional attachment to ideas. Matter of fact, Burke is often credited as one of the founding voices of conservatism. This yearning for a return to the great chain of being represents an idea that is at once conservative but also romantic, right? So how is it then that this romantic thought, the romanticism that these writers talk about, changed to make them defenders of the working class? To understand that, we must begin to take a look at some of the romantic figures who did their writings during the middle of this Industrial Revolution. In England, for example, in 1798, you had two young English poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who are going to produce a collaborative work called Lyrical Ballads, right? This book is revolutionary compared to the previous poems of the time. It's Romanticism on display. And when you compare it to the typical 18th century poems, this really stands out. There's 5 revealing, distinguishing characteristics of Romanticism that can be seen in Wordsworth and Coleridge's poetry. First of all, Romantic poetry stresses content over form. Second, Romantic poetry, emotion is good and feeling is to be embraced and shared. Third, Romanticism emphasizes the feeling of individuals, right? Fourth, Romanticism yearns for the past, a nostalgia. It often sees the past as better than the present, right? And finally, fifth, Romanticism celebrates nature. So we see this characteristic show up again and again and again in all kinds of romantic work, or works of the Romantics, I guess the better way to put that. For example, romantic novels like by authors like Sir Walter Scott, Mary Shelley, Victor Hugo. Romantic paintings like David and Friedrich and Turner, romantic music like Beethoven, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Liszt, and Wagner. But how does this relate to the Industrial Revolution? The Romantics would begin by just voicing their opinions on this new Industrial Revolution, right? People like William Blake, who would put forth the question of what would Jesus think of these dark satanic mills in the New Jerusalem, right? Percy Blythe Shelley argued in his Defense of Poetry, published in 1840, that poets are the acknowledged legislators of the world, and he sought to use that power to urge his fellow Britons towards reform and revolution in poems such as England in 1819 and Song to the Men of England, right? Most romantics um, rejected society and its mores and living unconventional lives and dying romantic deaths, right? The English romantics had welcomed the French Revolution. They had hoped and expected the same thing to happen in industrial England, right? Beyond England, continental romantics, including Schiller, Beethoven, Manzoni, and Pushkin, took up the call, producing romantic works that had political messages in them. But radical change never came. The great romantic revolution never materialized. Britain doesn't have a French-style revolution. Instead, it experiences a gradual change that's driven more by the middle class and liberalism. France's first revolution turned into Napoleon's empire. Its second revolution there of 1830 was more of a middle-class liberal revolution, not romantic. Louis Philippe was more of a bourgeoisie figure. He wasn't dashing, right? The English, the French, and German romantics would all have to travel to find their congenial revolutions. Ultimately, the romantics will have to acquiesce to the liberal thought of the day, right? It's not from lack of trying, though. John Ruskin, for example, urged for a return to medieval guild organizations and craftsmanship. You can actually see his influences in the neo-Gothic buildings of the Houses of Parliament that were built in the 1830s to the 1850s. Thomas Carlyle saw society's best hope was the ascent of some great hero, some combination of Napoleon and Superman, if you will, to right the wrongs of the Industrial Revolution. Matthew Arnold is similar to John Stuart Mill in that he urged better education, but the tone of his writing is a little bit more resigned, as if to say civilization has seen its best days, right? You can kind of see like almost a defeatism to it. The Romantics had plenty of passion. The problem is they had no clear plan on how to bring it into existing society or how to erect a new one, right? Kind of like the radical counterculture of the 1960s, right? The Romantics knew how to inspire strong feelings and indignation and a feeling of an injustice in society, but not necessarily on how to create imminent and permanent change, right? But there was their emphasis on individuality and emotion and nostalgia for the past, which could have played a role why they inevitably failed. E.T.A. Hoffmann, the German writer, referred to the Romantics as infinite longing, right? Achieving their goals was just beyond the Romantics' capacity. So the legacy of the Romantics is not really too dissimilar of the counterculture of the 1960s in that while they didn't affect much in the way of political change, they did change how people thought, right? They did change attitudes and ways of thinking. They dominated the world's literature of the time, music, painting, all the way into the 19-teens, honestly. In terms of popular culture, technically, we're still romantics. I mean, take a look at what popular music and film and television has to offer. You see a lot of romanticism in it. And in some ways, the next group that we're going to talk about reacting to the Industrial Revolution is the mirror image of the Romantics. When we talk about the socialists, the early socialists have a rational plan, but they have no passion. Romantics are passion with no plan. Socialists are plans with no passion. So the socialists' most famous adherents are going to begin to combine and inspire them both. Socialists will develop kind of a romanticist feel. As a matter of fact, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels could be argued to be the world's most successful romantics.